This presentation will cover the Scramble for Africa. The content lines up with World History Patterns of Interaction, Chapter 27, Sections 1 and 2. The outline we'll be using is adapted from Western Civilizations by W. Norton Publishers. We often misunderstand and even see Africa misrepresented in terms of its size. The following map comes from The Economist magazine and is intended to give you an idea of how big Africa really is in comparison to some of the places we know better. Geographically, one of the features that strikes me most is the size of what is the Sahara Desert, which covers this area. You can see is nearly or as big as the continental United States. The Sahara separates North Africa from the rest of Africa. This is usually called East Africa. This part over here is West Africa. We're going to talk a bit about Congo, which is in this region. South Africa here was settled by the Dutch, and then the British in conflict with a couple native tribes, most specifically the Zulus. If you consider how many diverse ethnicities or nations we have in Western Europe, we can imagine just how diverse this part of Africa alone may be. Moreover, if you consider how many different Native American tribes we had in the U.S. before it was the U.S., you can see that that covers a huge chunk of land there. Africa saw some settlement along the coast by many different Europeans, most specifically along the coastline for trading ports. Africa is often referred to as the Dark Continent. The first part of our outline is looking at Africa before European domination. As mentioned before, in the map from The Economist, we meant to represent that Africa is extremely diverse. Number one, there were thousands of languages spoken. Number two, thousands of ethnic groups with varied political, social, religious systems. Finally, number three, it's important to note that North Africa was largely Muslim and had a history of autonomy. The Congo is where we saw a lot more interest by Europeans, led chiefly by the Belgian King Leopold. Again, we are talking about a new drive into Africa. They were especially looking for fertile land and other natural resources. One of the key European leaders to be pushing for colonization in Africa was the Belgian King Leopold II. He lived from 1835 to 1909, ruling from 1865 to 1909. Again, while he lived from 1835 to 1909, he reigned from 1865 to his death in 1909. Another key figure would be Stanley and his scientific journeys in an attempt to colonize further into Africa. The next important piece would be the Treaty of Berlin. It comes as a result of the reaction of other European leaders and nations and interest in Africa, as well as other parts of the world. But here we're going to deal with Africa. It's important to note that the Treaty of Berlin is where they divided up Africa amongst European nations. The key guy there would be Otto von Bismarck. The treaty established ground rules for a new phase of European expansion. The key players would be Britain, France, and Germany. Again, the key players are Britain, France, and Germany. And then lastly, the Congo would be open to free trade. So again, to reiterate, chaired by Otto von Bismarck, it set ground rules for European expansion. The key players were Britain, France, Germany, and the Congo would be open to free trade. There's a couple important political cartoons and other pictures that will help illustrate these points. And finally, as in many other parts of the world, primarily the Middle East, the following cartoon will help to illustrate some of those lingering problems, at least in Africa. As we mentioned, most of these countries were working to increase their holdings in Africa for strategic and often economic reasons. Germany will really be reluctant under Bismarck to colonize, but it did understand that being an industrialized nation, it had to keep up with the others, like France and Britain. Germany will seize Cameroon and Tanzania. Again, Germany has very few colonies, but the primary ones were Tanzania and Cameroon. France will look to move eastward across the continent, but modern-day France is still concerned primarily with some of their former North African colonies, and we'll discuss that probably late in semester 2. And then finally, we'll talk about the British, whom one of the key people that worked for the British was a man named Cecil Rhodes. The also key area that the British work to control in the long term will be South Africa.